Hello, everyone, and welcome to the PCBL Planning Grant webinar. This is being held on both March 8th at 10 a.m. Mountain, as well as March 9th, which is a Wednesday, and that will be at 3 p.m. Mountain Time. This recording is also available for anybody interested in applying for the PCBL Planning Grant. So here's the agenda. This is going to take 40 minutes or less, and there will be time for people to ask questions if you have any. We're going to do some introductions here in just a second. Then we're going to go over the PCBL Planning Grant objectives. I'll be calling up some Utah code and sharing some links with you as well in this slide deck. We will also look at USBE's recently revised and updated PCBL framework. Both of these, the Utah code and the framework, will be called upon in the planning grant application for the PCBL program. Now, the funding for this does cover 5 total years. The planning grant is for 1 year, and then there are 2 years which are called the implementation phase. So during this first year in this grant that you're applying for, which is competitive, you will be mapping out what will happen as you're planning to implement PCBL in your school or district. That implementation will be funded for 2 years, and then we have an additional 2 years after that where the funding is decreased a little bit, but it's an expansion phase as you then become sustainable in your PCBL program in your school or district. We're going to walk through the PCBL Planning Grant application. That will take the majority of our time. Then we will also look at the scoring metrics for your application. I'll finish by going over the deadline and timeline of this grant process, as well as when the funding will be available, and then we'll have time for answering any questions. So a quick introduction. My name is Michael Hakkarainen. I am the PCBL, which stands for Personalized Competency-Based Learning, specialist with the Digital Teaching and Learning team here at the Utah State Board of Education. I will be along for the ride with you in this grant application process, and then also available for support in your first year and the ongoing years. As well as hosting what's called the PCBL Review Committee meetings. And if your school is selected, then you will be invited to those meetings as well, which happen monthly. And it's that review committee that will look at your application and vote on if it is accepted. Okay, so let's take a look first at the PCBL Planning Grant objectives. These come directly from Utah Code 53F-5. 53F-5-5. And there is a link right here on this document. If you click on this picture, it will open that site at the Utah State Legislature, and you'll be able to read through this entire part of Personalized Competency-Based Learning Grants Program, which was put into place May 5th of 2021. It is broken down into 7 sections. We will be focusing on section 502, which talks about our program here, as well as the planning grants, which is in section 503. Let's jump ahead. There we go. Now, if we look at section 502, which mentions the technical assistance training that's included, that's speaking specifically to this webinar and this recording. In this webinar, you're going to get instructions on completing the grant and the application requirements. We're going to talk about the scoring metrics, and then we're going to share some information on personalized competency-based learning. So to answer that first part, what are the requirements? If you look at section 503, which is specifically about planning grants, you'll see that the state board shall, subject to legislative appropriations, award a planning grant to an LEA, that's you, that number 1, submits an application that meets the requirements established by the state board. 2, has attended this technical assistance or watched this video or attended the boot camp at USET. And 3, if the application is recommended by the review committee, which I just discussed. I want to point this out right here. For the planning grant, the funding you will receive shall be spent in that first 1 calendar year, which is between July of 2022 and June of 2023. So you will need to spend all of the funding within that first year. Later down the road, the implementation grant funding is flexible over those 2 years, as well as the expansion grant. The next part of that section, when we get to number 2, has the actual implementation grant requirements. You're going to provide a general description of your LEA, you're going to share your plan for school-wide implementation. And if it's not school-wide or district-wide, that's okay. It can be for a smaller population, but you should include a phasing of how you're going to phase the plan into the school-wide or district-wide learning community over a specified period of time. And it could be in your first year, it could be in 5 years, depends on how large your LEA is. So that is flexible. You just need to define it for us. Describe the type of partners that you'll be working with. You'll have to explain how your activities and programs will focus on the core principles described in section 53F502, and that's referring directly to the PCBL framework, which is also linked in here. We'll talk about that in just a minute. We want to make sure that you have methods that align with our PCBL framework, as well as outcome-based measures that will align with that framework. Finally, you'll also have to show your capacity, qualifications, local governing support, time to successfully plan your program, and an intentional and feasible planning process for rolling out PCBL in your LEA. We'll talk more about the budget when we get to that part of the application. Now let's talk a little bit about Utah's PCBL framework. This picture is also a link to the PCBL framework. If you click on it, it will take you directly to the framework, which is a PDF. It is 12 pages front and back. You'll see that the first 4 or 5 pages are mostly just like introductions. But when you get to page 9, you'll see our broken down the strategic plan, our definition of personalized learning, a link description to Portrait of a Graduate, which is kind of our North Star in this program. PCBL is designed to help educate our learners in a way that meets the characteristics of the Utah graduate that are defined in the Portrait of a Graduate, as well as the P20 competencies. And then after the introduction, which has parts both for educators, students, and families, and describes the framework organization, you'll see these, the essential components, and there are 5. Then when you look at these 5 essential components, you might be thinking to yourself, how are you going to address all 5 of them in your planning grant application? And the answer is, you don't. Instead, just identify what you've already done. If you have the Utah's Portrait of a Graduate or anything like that, that would align to your culture of learning. If you're implementing professional learning that's related again to learner agency, if you have a demonstrated competency and assessment system already in place, what have you already done? And then tell us, what are you going to work on next? Identify 1 or 2 that will fit your strategic plan for your district over the next couple of years, and then lay out where the rest of these components will come into play as you move along in your journey to personalized competency-based learning. Now, the funding for this program starts here in the next year, 2023. We receive $1,996,500 every year to fund this program. We have to disperse that money amongst those LEAs in the planning grant phase, as well as the implementation grant phase, which is going to be an increase in funding, and then the expansion grant phase, the next 2 years, which is going to be a decrease in funding. So this is how it's laid out. Our plan is to accept 5 applications this year. That's $250,000 split up among 5 for the first year, which is a $50,000 funding for that first year. That then jumps up to $1 million over 2 years, which means there would be $200,000 to be spent over 2 years, or $100,000 a year. Now that is flexible. You don't have to spend exactly $100,000 each year. You can spend more or less the first or the second year. Same thing happens with the expansion grant. Now the amount of funding is less at $387,500. And that should be split up among 5 LEAs, not 7. That would provide $137,500 to be spent over 2 years. The only thing we're asking here is that you don't spend more than $75,000 the first year, and then you have $62,500 the second year, or additional if you didn't spend the total $75,000. That adds up to be almost $2 million over 5 years. $1,937,500. That's what our funding is right now, but there's a big if. If the amount of funding that we receive from the state were to go up, which is possible, or an LEA leaves the program, which could also happen, then this amount that you've seen laid out right here will actually go up. So it is possible to receive more money over the next 5 years than what I've just laid out for you. All right, with all that background, let's dive into the actual application. I'm going to put a copy in the chat, or put a link to it in the chat here for you. Great. So here's what's the breakdown of this application. At first glance, it's a lot of pages and it might seem like a lot of work. On top of that, it is a competitive grant, so you're going to want to have quality work. But it's not a ton of actual submissions. It's a lot of information and then a lot of places to add the following information. First, there's going to be a real simple table to complete that has your LEA contacts. And there's also a link to a Google form that I'd like you, I know it's double work, but if you could do that, then we have a way of reaching out to you. And that's so that we can support you through the grant application process. Then comes 3 parts. The first is the why. And there's a real just basic letter of intent that we're asking for. Why is your district interested in PCBL? Are you moving towards a portrait of a graduate design? Are you adjusting the culture of learning for your school district? Do you see opportunities for competency-based education? Let us know why you are moving towards this PCBL direction. Then there's some whats. And this shouldn't take nearly as long as the why. We need an LEA overview. We're looking for demographics. We'd like you to identify the campus or campuses where you will be implementing PCBL, and then give us a little summary of your past PCBL experiences. Some districts have been working with competency-based outcomes and learning since way back in 2016 or 17. So if that's in your history, share it with us. Then comes the big part, the how. We'd like you to identify what are the priorities for this program. What are your action steps? Who are the partners you're going to be working with? And then this is a little different. Who are the stakeholders that you will be collaborating with? So let us know about student organizations, specific educators or subject areas, parent-teacher association, anything like that. Tell us who your stakeholders are. And then the last part is we want to know how you're going to spend this money. So we have a budget table and a short justification for you to complete, followed by assurances and commitments. Before I jump into the grant, though, I just want you to know there is some other support in place for you. We partner with the New Teacher Project. They will be doing they have been for years now, actually, been doing monthly webinars with LEAs that are accepted into the planning cohort. And Jim Larson has been our contact there. He walks everybody through some tips on implementing PCBL. It's a great place to collaborate with your colleagues. And then he also helps with guidance as you start writing your implementation grant, which comes the year after. He's also available through office hours and individual coaching as you're beginning to write this grant. So if you need information on that, we will share that with you as well. And it's actually tucked into the grant. All right, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions in the chat. Okay. Right on. So here we go. Let's look at the grant. I've opened it up in Google. The nice thing about having it in Google is you're simply going to click on File and make a copy. Once you've made a copy for yourself in your district, share it back with me. I'll give you my email in a second. And that way, as you're going through the grant, if you ever come upon a question like, hey, we missed this webinar, you can always leave a comment and tag me in it. And then I can communicate with you directly inside the grant and support you as you go through the process. On the first page, you're going to see just the breakdown of the webinars that need to be attended. And then I'm going to update this with a link to this recording, which you may have clicked on to find. Here's my email, as well as Todd Call. I'm the education specialist for PCBL here at the DTL group, and Todd is the coordinator. Either of us can answer your questions, but if you just contact me, I will be able to respond to you right away. You scroll down to the second page, there is a little history of our PCBL grant, as well as the definitions, both the original and the updated for competency-based education that we work with. Then we get to the overview, which just breaks down what needs to happen in this grant. You're attending this webinar, completing the table on page 5 of your grant application. And then if you could, there's the webinars again. There is a little form to complete that just gives us your team lead, webinar verification, baseline snapshot survey. That should only take a couple minutes to complete. We just ask that you do that by the end of the month. That way, by the time April 1st rolls around, we know exactly who we're working with as far as applicants for this program. If you need additional support, you can click right here and contact TNTP and be able to set up an appointment with them. There's no cost to you for that at all. We'll have an optional webinar, 2 of them actually, on April 13th at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. where I'll just be doing questions and answers. No presentation like this, just your questions, and we'll get everything squared away. Then that gives you a couple days to get your letter of intent into us, which is due on the 15th. And finally, the deadline is May 29th. Now, basically what will happen here is if you shared your Google Doc application with me, I would then take ownership of it and turn off your editing rights. And I'll just confirm with everybody that you're ready to go and everything is all set. I know that sometimes you wonder, like, well, what happens if we have a change to make after April 29th? My plan here is to be supporting you as you go so that when we reach the deadline, we reach that together and everything's ready for submission. Okay, little set of directions in here with some context. You can read about the USBE rule 2777112 about submitting the grant and just qualifications. Then we have down here your first area of submission. I think this is page 3 or 4. This is where you're going to complete the table. We do need to know who the superintendent or charter school executive director is, as well as their email address and phone number. And if they don't attend this webinar or watch this recording, then the PCBL manager, which is the second line, would be the person that goes in and makes sure that they're aware of all of the information. And then you can add rows as you go. You need to have 4 team members from your district, and 1 of them needs to be the PCBL planning grant manager. Okay, again, there is a Calendly link to schedule a time with TNTP for more support after that. You are going to find a lot of redundancy in this document just because we want to make sure you can find what you need when you need it. Here are the deadlines again.
Is there a way for us to, or do you need us to submit proof that the superintendent has watched the webinar?
No, just signature is fine with me.
Okay.
Unless you want to videotape the superintendent watching them, you don't have to do that. This then takes us directly into part 1, the why. Provide us in your letter of intent, your planning grant team, a link to your strategic plan, your how your LEA leadership envisions PCBL, and how it is anchored into 1 or more of your strategic plan priorities. What do you hope to accomplish by the end of the planning grant, which is going to be, actually, that's off by a year, 2023. That's why I love Google Docs. Then we have our 3 different technical support partners listed out and everything that you need there. Okay, here's a little breakdown on TNTP and what they supply and provide as far as support, office hours, coaching, monthly webinars. There's another partnership we work with. It's Mastery Transcript Consortium. One of the big hurdles with a competency-based program comes when parents are thrown off by the non-traditional grading structure. They immediately worry about not only grade point averages, but how that will affect things like college acceptance and scholarship availability. So we work with Mastery Transcript Consortium, which is creating a mastery transcript that's based on student competency. And higher ed organizations here in Utah, USHE, are partnering with them as well and working on ways to accept a mastery transcript. If that's something of interest to you, they do provide office hours and can provide that service to your district as well. And that's through the grant funds that. So it wouldn't come out of your budget or your budget for the grant, but just comes out of the PCBL funding altogether. More links to the what and the webinars. And then we get into part 2, which asks for your LEA's name, an overview or narrative form, the PCBL initiatives, where it's relevant to work you've already done and what's coming next. And then you'll see these text boxes, and this is where you can enter all of that information. Brevity and clarity are better than just lengthy responses. So you will see like some minimum or maximum wordage, but keep it simple, keep it clear, and keep it concise. Then we ask you to list out the schools that will be engaged in PCBL planning and implementation, a breakdown of the demographics of either your LEA or those schools, and then your plan for how these will align to the PCBL framework. So how are students empowered daily to make decisions in their learning experiences? How will assessment be meaningful, positive, and empowering? You may not hit all of these items, but let us know which ones align with your plan. Then develop a clear picture of what success looks like for your PCBL. You could use data if you're collecting it, test scores, attendance, whatever works for you. But you can dive in a little bit deeper to that when you look at section or number 7, which asks, how will you be informed by this description of impact? Describe the best measures for capturing the outcomes. And we have some examples of leading indicators, primary indicators, and long-term indicators. You tell us which ones you're going to use and what your baseline data will be. All right, so once you've articulated your long-term vision and your most appropriate way to measure and track progress, we would then want you to look at things like Noster's model for managing complex change and the Utah's PCBL framework, and tell us how you're going to make adjustments as you go. So you can do some backward design. We have some examples in here. This is why it's such a large document, but mostly this is just information for you to sort of like brainstorm your planning and how you're going to be effective with that. And then the how is your action plan. So tell us your short-term and long-term goals for personalized learning, blended learning, extended learning, professional learning with PCBL, and any other methods that emphasize the core principles, the PCBL framework. Question 9 is really short and simple. Are there any state statutes that would hinder your LEA from fully implementing the proposed program? So if it's like accountability for attendance, the 990, things like that, if any of that is in your way, we just want you to identify what it is, because we do have a flexibility guide that we will provide to you that will give you the information you need to apply for waivers and things like that. We realize that in order for PCBL to be successful, not only do we have to put supports in place for you, but we might have to remove some barriers. We just want to know what they are. So any concerns that come up, put them in this box, or you can say none. We honestly haven't had any identified yet that we haven't been able to make adjustments for. Then we get down to the final part, the budget table and the budget justification narrative. So this is where you're going to lay out for us, how are you going to spend that $50,000? Will it be on salaries, benefits, property, services, travel, things like that. So just give us a rough estimate. You can adjust this after funding begins. So if there's little tweaks that you need to make, it's not a problem. You just put it into Utah grants and we approve it. If there's ever a change that's greater than 20%, so for this grant, if you had to change something at like $10,000, then we just run it past the PCBL review committee for a vote. You justify why you're making that change, and then we approve it. And the final thing is of that part is the budget justification narrative. Just explain your funding requests, justify how you're going to allocate, why you're going to allocate money that way, and give us a little bit of a breakdown and summary of it. Then when you get to the very, very end, there is just this signature that is required by both the district superintendent or charter school executive director, and then the name of the LEA and the date. So I just want to make sure you have that signed. Sooner the better, so that when it's submitted, we don't have any issues. And then the very, very, very end is just a bunch of links to resources, much of which I talked about in this webinar, but they're there for you if you need them. Okay, that's the grant. Any questions about that so far? Anything stand out as an issue?
And I was hearing when we first started that tying it into our development of a portrait of a graduate or kind of a new culture of learning or a new strategic plan would also be appropriate.
Definitely. Let me go back here just a couple slides real quick. Right. So culture of learning is where each learner is supported by communities committed to creating the culture, structure, policies, and instructional practices that engage them in their journey towards college, career, and life readiness. So this is where you're going to have a common language, a common vision, common mission and goals. And that is your portrait of a graduate. Some other schools that have done this, JUAB, for example, has taken the Utah school, the Utah USBE portrait of a graduate, and adjusted it for their own learning community. And they call it Portrait of a Wasp, which is their high school mascot. We have vision for learning at the Alpine School District that aligns with the P20 competencies, but it's their own unique portrait of a graduate, profile of a graduate. That's exactly what we're looking for. And we've heard from a lot of school districts and states around the country that if you're missing that, all of the PCBL initiatives can sometimes fall flat. But when we do have an agreed upon profile of what our learners will look like and what competency looks like, then PCBL has its North Star, right? It's prime meridian to move in that direction. So if you're looking to develop your culture of learning through this PCBL planning grant process, please include that in your application because that's vital information. Okay, let's talk about how this is going to be scored. Yay. So this is a competitive grant. We are going to accept 5 LEAs into the program this year. So here's how we're grading your submissions. There is a 0, 1, or 2 criteria. And all of them are aligned to the PCBL framework and Utah's Portrait of a Graduate. So if you are familiar with both of those documents and you use that verbiage in your application, it will help you move you towards a 2, which is exceeding expectation. Number 1 is meeting expectations. Your material illustrates an understanding of PCBL framework and aligns with the Portrait of a Graduate, but maybe it needs a little additional support and how you're going to implement this in your LEA. So it's one thing to know the direction and the philosophies of PCBL, but you really need to connect it to what's going to happen in implementation eventually in your LEA. So that's where the difference between a 1 and a 2 is. And then a 0 is you just didn't do it. Now, not every part of the grant has a 0, 1, or 2. A lot of it comes down to yes or no. Like, did you complete the table? Did you attend the webinar or the USET bootcamp session? And by the way, Susie, if I see you at USET, you don't have to come to my session because it's going to be what you're watching right now. So you just earned an hour of time at USET, right? Then when we get to the why, did you complete the table? Yes or no? All of that is just yes or no. What's really going to separate, the wheat from the chaff, as they say, or the cream rises to the top, is when we get down here to the what. When we read your overview, your narrative form of PCBL initiatives and what you're planning and what work you've done, this is where you're going to get a 0, 1, or 2. Same for the section on what PCBL initiatives are you most interested in planning, and defining your clear picture of success, and then completing the leading primary and long-term indicators. We also have a 0, 1, or 2 for articulate the planning for key action steps, your timeline, stakeholder engagement, and evidence of accomplishment. So most of the scoring differential is going to happen in the what section. And then again in how when we get to your budget. You'll then receive a total score, and we'll also be putting in comments. Now, I'm not going to be scoring your application. That's going to be scored by the review committee. And the review committee is made up of 10 voting members from LEAs that have been involved in the planning process so far, as well as some administrators at USBE. April 29th is the deadline for the grant application. The very next week, I will then open up all of your applications so they can be reviewed by the review committee and then voted upon. Our committee meeting will be on May 26th, when we will compile all of the scores and make our decision, and not only notify the school districts or LEAs that have been accepted, but also the USBE Board of Education. We'll let them know who we've selected. That will then all be approved, and funding will begin on July 1st. So that's the timeline after the application is submitted. And now we'll see if you have any questions about that process. No? Okay, well, my goal was to do this webinar in 40 minutes, and it looks like it's going to be done in 33. So for those of you watching the recording, here's about 5 minutes of your time left. As soon as I tell you this, if you have any questions in the future, please take your version of the Google Doc and share it with me, michael.hakarainen@schools.utah.gov, and you can put in any comments or assign any tasks to me. If there's something more pressing, you can always email me. There's my email again, michael.hakarainen@schools.utah.gov. Or if there's an emergency, let's say it's the week before the deadline and some major thing happens and you need to get an answer from me right away, you can text or call me at 385-212 9058. But that is the best way to contact me. If I hear from you by that, I will be back in touch with you as soon as possible. A couple more events coming up. March 16th at USET, there will be a PCBL Planning Grant Bootcamp. You do not need to attend that if you watched this, unless you want to come see it again and ask a lot more questions. And then on April 13th, we will have the PCBL Planning Grant Q&A and webinar. Those will be sent out as invites to anybody who has completed the contact table form. That's how I'll send it out. So I will only be sharing that with people who are actually actively in the application phase by then, since the deadline is then going to come up on the 29th. All right, so thank you all for attending and for watching. I'm going to turn off the recording now and get ready to share it online for anybody who missed it.